Hey folks, ever since patch 10.0.7 released 2 weeks ago, the optimal Primordial Stone setups have changed quite a lot due to a combination of new discoveries and tuning patches pushed out by Blizzard. Thankfully, things seem to have settled down by this point, so I figured now would be the perfect time to go over the best Primordial Stone setup for every single spec in World of Warcraft. The builds I'll be showcasing in this video were sourced by looking at the top logs and Mythic Plus runs for every specialization. I also disregarded any logs or runs from March 23rd and earlier, since that was before the final set of tuning changes to Primordial Stones. For the purposes of this video, I'll be going over the best Primordial Stones in 4 different categories: single target raid damage, AoE raid damage, raid healing, and Mythic Plus. For Mythic Plus, I've also included a few subcategories, since things are a little bit more complicated for that compared to raiding, but I won't go into detail on that until we get to the actual Mythic Plus section of the video. Now, before I dive into the first category, I want to quickly mention that the following specs do not use the Onyx Amulet at all in the top level of every form of content. They are Frost DK, Unholy DK, Devastation Evoker, Elemental Shaman, Enhancement Shaman, and all Warlock specializations. To be clear, this doesn't mean you shouldn't use the ring if you're gearing up a brand new alt and the Onyx Amulet is your best option. These results just mean that at the highest level of play, the ring is actually a damage loss when compared to raw secondary stats. If you play one of these specs and are just trying to get caught up, you can still get some good value out of the builds discussed in this video, but make sure to sim your character and do a bit of research in order to figure out when you should be replacing the Onyx Amulet. Alright, so now we can talk about our first category, Raid Single Target, and this is primarily based around logs from Taros. The main reason I use Taros as an example is because it's the only single target boss in Vault of the Incarnates that doesn't have any pad or weird mechanics present. This still will apply to Aranog, Senarth, Karag, Dathia for the most part, not including the platforms, and of course Razageth and Diurna, assuming you're on eggs and not on ads. But those bosses can have a little bit of cheese that may dilute the rankings, but in terms of practical purposes, these are the stones that you would want to run on that boss. So first things first, the specs that do not want to run the Onyx Amulet on Raid Single Target is, once again, Frost DK, Unholy Devastation, but also Frost Mage, Elemental Shaman, Enhancement, and then all 3 Warlock specs, Affliction, Demonology, Destruction. So all of the specs previously mentioned, with the addition of Frost Mage in this case. I do not play a Frost Mage, so I'm not sure exactly why they made the list here, but none of their top logs for most of the single target fights are running the Onyx Amulet. Now, the first actual build we'll be discussing here is something people may recognize from earlier in the patch before all of the tuning changes. It is Prophetic Twilight, Desirous Blood, and Humming Arcane. This was universally the best ring setup prior to the large set of nerfs Blizzard did on March 23rd, but as of right now, it is run by one spec, that being Guardian Druid. Guardian Druids have a weird interaction with one of their talents that makes the Arcane Stone still very good for them, but everybody else has swapped to a different setup. One thing you will notice, though, is the combination of Prophetic Twilight and Desirous Blood is used in basically every single ring setup. Prophetic Twilight makes your stones that trigger a healing effect also trigger any of your damaging stones, and vice versa. Your damaging stones trigger all of your healing stones. The reason this works well is because with Desirous Blood, which deals damage and heals, it actually counts as a healing stone. So Desirous Blood will trigger your damage stones, and your damage stones will trigger Desirous Blood. So it's a really nice combo that initially people thought was an exploit, but Blizzard seems to think it's intended, so it has become a staple in almost every single setup that we'll be seeing here. The main difference in most of these builds is what their third stone is. Which brings us to our next setup, Prophetic Twilight, Desirous Blood, and Freezing Ice. This is generally regarded as the best single target build for the Onyx Amulet, and it is used by the following specs: Blood Death Knight, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Feral Druid, Beast Mastery Hunter, Marksmanship Hunter, Survival Hunter, Arcane Mage, Fire Mage, Brewmaster Monk, Mistweaver Monk, Woodwalker Monk, Holy Paladin, Protection Paladin, Retribution Paladin, Shadow Priest, kind of, we'll get to that, Assassination Rogue, Subtlety Rogue, Outlaw Rogue, Arms, once again, kind of, and Protection Warrior. So you'll notice I said kind of for Shadow Priest and Arms, and that's because specifically this build on single target is not actually quote-unquote best in slot for them. All of the very, very top logs on most of the single target fights do not run the ring at all for Shadow and Arms. That said, specifically on single target, it is actually very, very close for both of these specs, so it is actually worth running unless you have the literal best-in-slot ring setup that is not using the Onyx Amulet. But as a little spoiler warning, this is the only time that Shadow and Arms will be showing up under one of the ring builds. The ring is pretty terrible for them on any multi-target fight, so really you don't need to worry about it if you are Shadow or Arms, but I wanted to include it here as an honorable mention. Now, all the other specs are pretty much using this on every single target boss, but I do want to give one quick warning to anyone progressing Mythic Raszageth with this ring setup using Freezing Ice. If you attack the little wind adds during the second intermission, you have a chance to apply the Freezing Ice dot to them, which will also slow them and completely fuck up your Resto Druid's Mass Entanglement. This is really bad, and early on in the patch, my raid wiped multiple times to this happening until we realized what was going on. So if you do plan on using this setup on Raszageth, because it is still very good on that fight, be very careful to not attack the Storm adds until your Resto Druid has Mass Entangled all of them. Just wanted to throw that out there because it is a good build that a lot of people will be running, and this is a really important interaction that can wipe your raid. But while that covers most specializations, there is one other build that a few specs are running for single target, and that is Prophetic Twilight, Desirous Blood, and Storm Infused. Now, many people may know already that this is a very strong multi-target build, and we'll get to that when we get to Mythic Plus and Raid AoE, but this build is actually run on single target by Havoc Demon Hunters, Balanced Druids, kind of, once again, we'll get to that, Resto Druids, and Fury Warriors. Now, Havoc Demon Hunters and Fury Warriors are the ones who will primarily be running this. Balanced Druids only kind of want to run this. It's the same deal with Shadow and Arms, where most of them at the top end do not run the ring at all, but some of the pure single target builds will run this ring, and it is only slightly off, so I wanted to include it here as an honorable mention. Now, for Resto Druid, I will hold off on commenting on that until we discuss the final category, which I am calling Run All of the Above. And this includes Preservation, somewhat, Discipline Priest, Holy Priest, and Resto Shaman. And I want to take this opportunity, now that we've gone over all of the main single target builds, to discuss the healer situation, because I know a lot of healers may be confused why I'm including your specs here in the damage category, and that's because the ring is actually quite good for you as a damage ring. A lot of healers aren't actually running this with healing stones, they are running it with damage stones, and then when they have nothing to heal, they DPS, because quite frankly, that is something that a lot of people do at high level, and I know a lot of healers really hate to have to do damage, but it is a thing that a lot of top healers do. So when I say in this list that the stones are good for Resto Druid and Holy Paladin and Resto Shaman, etc., I'm not saying you absolutely need to run it. I am saying that if you plan on doing damage as a healer, these are the setups that you should be using. And for Preservation, Discipline, Holy Priest, and Resto Shaman, their logs are kind of all over the place. I've seen them running all three builds, and there doesn't seem to be any consistency as to which one is the strongest for them, so you could probably run any setup and have it be good, but I would say generally you're going to get more value out of Freezing Ice and Storm Infused. I think the people still running Humming Arcane probably just haven't bothered to swap it after the nerfs. Now, moving on, we have Raid AoE damage, and to kick things off, we will cover the specs that do not run the ring at all. And there's going to be a lot of familiar faces here, starting with Frost Decay, Unholy Death Knight, Balanced Druid, Devastation Evoker, Beast Mastery Hunter, Marksmanship Hunter, Arcane Mage, Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman, Enhancement Shaman, all three Warlock specs, and Arms Warrior. So, as previously mentioned, all of the same ones that never use the ring don't use the ring, but there's a few new additions like the Mage specs, Beast Mastery Hunters who pretty much only run it on single target, and of course Arms Warrior and Shadow Priest as previously mentioned. Now, the first build from Raid AoE is one we've already seen. It is Prophetic Twilight, Desirous Blood, and Humming Arcane. And this is run by, you guessed it, Guardian Druid, and just Guardian Druid. Yeah, they're weird. This is a single target ring build, and for whatever reason, it is still better than Storm Infused for them on single target. But for literally every other spec, your best option for AoE is going to be Prophetic Twilight, Desirous Blood, and Storm Infused. Now, I will give a few quick disclaimers here. Frost Mage, Assassination Rogue, and Subtlety all have a bit of a mix in most of their logs. Frost Mages in many cases don't run the ring at all, but some of the top logs do run it, so I wanted to include it. Subtlety Rogues in some cases on high target AoE fights like Primal Council are not running the ring, but there is still a very heavy representation. An Assassination is a bit weird where a lot of their top AoE logs are actually running Freezing Ice instead of Storm Infused. I'm not entirely sure if it's just a few Assassination rogues that got really good procs and forgot to take off their single target ring, or if it has some weird interaction on them that makes it really good, but most of them are still running Storm Infused, so I'm including them in this category. But that's the best damage build for the vast majority of specs on AoE damage, and as previously mentioned with all of the healers, only run this if you are trying to build for damage. You could just not run it. A lot of healers choose not to. And speaking of healers, for raid healing, there is pretty much one universal build that all healing specs have been running, and that is Deluging Water, Exuding Steam, and Wild Spirit. And while this is technically used by all of the specs, Resto Druid really doesn't fit into this category. I'm still keeping it there because if we're talking about the best healing ring setup, this is the best for Resto Druid, but the vast majority of Resto Druids are either running a damaging ring setup or they are just not running it at all. In fact, on almost every single boss, the top Resto Druid healing parse is not using the ring. Now, healing parses are of course a bit weird, you have to take them with a grain of salt, but I did want to mention that. That being said, for the other 6 healing specs, pretty much all of their top healing parses are using this ring setup, so if all you care about is doing a ton of healing and you don't want to damage weave, this is probably what you should be using. And last but not least, we have the Mythic Plus category, and this one is a bit weird. As previously mentioned, I'm going to be using multiple subcategories because there's a lot of different variables in Mythic Plus, and it's really hard in most cases to say this ring setup is the best for most of these specializations. So once again, to kick things off, the specs that will never run the ring in any shape or form in Mythic Plus are Frost Death Knights, Unholy Death Knights, Balanced Druids, Devastation Evokers, Beast Mastery Hunters, Arcane Mages, Fire Mages, Frost Mages, Shadow Priests, Elemental Shamans, Enhancement Shamans, all of the Warlock specs, and Arms. While this is pretty similar to the raid AoE section, I figured it was worth repeating it. Now, for the remaining specializations, things are a bit more tricky. Other than Havoc Demon Hunter and Fury Warrior, which run the Storm Infused setup for literally everything, most specs will alternate between Freezing Ice and Storm Infused on a case-by-case basis. For Tyrannical keys, players tend to run Freezing Ice, and for Fortified keys, you tend to see more people using Storm Infused. Since you can't really go wrong with either one, and there are way too many variables at play to say which is the best setup for Mythic Plus, I decided to sort the specializations into 2 different categories. The first one contains the specs that will always run the ring in every single Mythic Plus dungeon, though they may swap between Freezing Ice or Storm Infused depending on the affixes or the specific dungeon. These specs are Blood Death Knight, Havoc Demon Hunter, Guardian Druid, Survival Hunter, Windwalker Monk, Assassination Rogue, Outlaw Rogue, Resto Shaman, and Fury Warrior. Resto Shaman is a bit of an odd man out here considering it's a healing spec, but I genuinely could not find a single high-level Mythic Plus run from a Resto Shaman that wasn't running one of the damage setups in their Onyx Amulet. Also, all top-end Guardian Druids appear to have abandoned the Humming Arcane setup for Mythic Plus, and they now alternate between Freezing Ice and Storm Infused just like most other specs on this list. The second category contains specializations that sometimes run a damage-focused Onyx Amulet in high keys. These specs are Vengeance Demon Hunter, Feral Druid, Restoration Druid, Preservation Evoker, Marksmanship Hunter, Brewmaster Monk, Mistweaver, Holy Paladin, Protection Paladin, Retribution Paladin, Discipline Priest, Holy Priest, Subtlety Rogue, and Protection Warrior. If a spec falls into this category, it's because around 25% or more of its top Mythic Plus runs were done with either a Freezing Ice or Storm-infused Onyx Amulet equipped. That being said, many of the specs in this category, such as Protection Paladin, Vengeance Demon Hunter, or Subtlety Rogue, opted not to run the Onyx Amulet at all in many of their top keys. This is also true to an extent for all of the other specs in this category, but the 3 that I mentioned by name were the biggest outliers. As for Brewmaster Monks, Preservation Evokers, Discipline Priests, and Holy Priests, some of their top keys were done using a different Primordial Stone setup entirely that was more focused on either healing or survivability. The healing setup is the same one discussed before when going over raid healing: Deluging Water, Exuding Steam, and Wild Spirit. As mentioned, this is run sometimes by Preservation, Discipline Priest, and Holy Priest. If a healer spec isn't on this list, then that means none of their top runs were done using healing stones. However, don't take this as a sign that you should not be using healing stones at all. If you're just trying to do low keys and trying to fill your vault, it's totally fine. Go for it, run your healing stones. These are the only ones that were running it at a high level. Also, I found 1 or 2 healers running a mix of Exuding Steam, Prophetic Twilight, and one of the damage stones, so either Freezing Ice or Storm Infused. This wasn't common enough for me to make an entire section on it, but I did want to note that it at least existed. Not sure if it's good or if just 1 or 2 people wanted to play around with it, but I figured I'd at least give it a honorable mention. And last but certainly not least, we have to talk about the few Brewmaster monks that are running a tank stone build, specifically Shining Obsidian, Cold Frost, and Indomitable Earth. Now, I did find at a few lower level keys there were a few different tank specs running this, but there are 2 Brewmasters in particular that at very high levels are running this setup for like top end Mythic Plus keys, so I figured I had to include it in this video as a quote-unquote top ring setup, even though there are still a lot of other Brewmaster monks that are running the typical Storm-Infused Stone setup. Also, as a tank main myself, I do want to give a very strong disclaimer that you should not be running this build in Raid. It is really, really, really bad in Raid. I can't really speak to high-end Mythic Plus for Brewmaster monks. I personally have not been pushing on my Brewmaster monk. If some of them are running it, go for it, give it a shot, but please, for raids, run a damaging stone setup as a tank. It is going to benefit your raid much more than a mediocre shield every few seconds. But with that, we've covered every single Primordial Stone setup that is used at high-end keys and raiding. If you found the video informative and helpful, make sure to throw it a like, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.